Deep beneath the misty mountains, in the shattered halls of Khazad-dûm, two forces occupied the same ruined kingdom for thousands of years. Orcs had infested the upper levels and passages of the old dwarf city since at least the late Second Age. A Balrog, last survivor of Morgoth's First Age host, dwelt in the deepest reaches below. There is no record in any of Tolkien's writings of a battle between these two groups. The Orcs never attacked the Balrog. The Balrog never drove the Orcs out. This coexistence is one of the strangest facts in the history of Middle-earth, and it demands an answer grounded in chronology, geography, and the nature of the beings involved. The story begins with the dwarves. Khazad-dûm was the greatest of the dwarf mansions, founded by Durin I in the deep years of the First Age, before the rising of the sun. For thousands of years the Longbeards prospered there, mining and working the riches of the misty mountains. The kingdom reached its height under a line of kings named Durin, whom the dwarves believed were reincarnations of the first father. The sixth king in this line was Durin VI, and he ruled during the middle years of the Second Age. Under his reign the dwarves mined deeper than they ever had before, pursuing a vein of mithril, the true silver, the most precious metal in Middle-earth, found only in Khazad-dûm. Mithril was extraordinarily valuable. Its lightness, strength, and beauty made it worth 10 times its weight in gold. The deepest deposits lay far below the inhabited halls, in the roots of the mountain, in places the dwarves had not previously explored. In the year 1980 of the Third Age, miners working the deepest mithril seams broke through into a sealed cavern, something that had been hidden there since the end of the First Age was released. The dwarves named it Durin's Bane, for it killed Durin VI in that same year. The next king, Nain I, ruled for only 1 year. He too was slain by the Balrog in TA 1981. After Nain's death, the dwarves of Khazad-dûm fled. They abandoned their ancient mansion, the greatest of all dwarf halls, and scattered across Middle-earth. Some went north to the Grey Mountains, others eventually founded new holdings in the Blue Mountains or at Erebor. The Balrog had the mountain to itself. What the dwarves had disturbed was a Balrog, one of the Valaraukar, the demons of power from the First Age. Balrogs were originally Maya, spirits of the same order as Sauron, Gandalf, and the other Istari. In the earliest days of the world, when Melkor first rebelled against the other Valar, he drew many Maiar into his service. Some of these became Balrogs. Tolkien describes them as spirits whose hearts were of fire, but who were cloaked in darkness, and terror went before them. They carried whips of flame. Among Morgoth's servants, the Balrogs were the most feared after the dragons, and in the First Age they were the most feared of all. They served as Morgoth's elite warriors and captains, and several of them are named in the old narratives. The most famous Balrog of the First Age was Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. Gothmog led the Balrog host in many of the major battles of the First Age. He killed Feanor at the gates of Angband, surrounding him with a force of Balrogs and striking him down. He killed Fingon in the Battle of the Nirnaethar-nuediad, the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, bringing the High King of the Noldor down with his axe and then crushing him with his mace. Gothmog himself was slain during the fall of Gondolin, when he fought the elf-lord Ecthelion in the Square of the King. Both perished in that combat, and Ecthelion's sacrifice became one of the most celebrated deeds of the First Age. Another Balrog was killed in the same battle by Glorfindel, who threw himself and the demon from the cliffs of the encircling mountains. The eagle Thorondor retrieved Glorfindel's body afterward. These deaths reduced the number of Balrogs, though the exact count of Balrogs that ever existed is a matter of dispute. Tolkien's early writings gave large numbers, but his later conception reduced them significantly. The precise total is uncertain. Durin's Bane was not Gothmog. Gothmog died at Gondolin. Durin's Bane was a different Balrog, one that survived the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age. When the host of the Valar broke Angband and overthrew Morgoth, most of his servants were destroyed or scattered. Some fled into the deep places of the earth. Durin's Bane escaped the ruin and made its way south through the roots of the mountains, eventually coming to rest in the caverns beneath Khazad-dûm. It remained there, dormant and hidden, for over 5,000 years. The dwarves had no knowledge of its presence. They built their kingdom above it, mined around it, and prospered for millennia before the mithril seam led them too deep. After the dwarves fled in TA 1981, the question of who controlled Moria becomes central. Orcs were present in the Misty Mountains long before the Balrog's release. They had troubled the dwarves and the men of the Vales of Anduin for centuries. Sauron, operating from Dol Guldur in southern Mirkwood during the Third Age, expanded his influence over many of the Orc tribes of the mountains. He sent agents and commands to various groups, coordinating attacks and gathering intelligence. His influence over the Orcs of the Misty Mountains was real and consequential. In TA 2941, during the events leading to the Battle of Five Armies, Sauron's northern Orcs mustered under Azog's son Bolg and marched against Erebor. The relationship between Sauron and the Balrog is far less clear. Sauron was a Maia of great power, originally named Mairon, who had served Morgoth in the First Age and become the second Dark Lord after Morgoth's defeat. He commanded vast armies of orcs, men, and other creatures. He commanded the Nazgûl. He commanded the trolls and wargs and many of the spiders, but there is no recorded direct command between Sauron and Durin's Bane. Tolkien never states that Sauron ordered the Balrog to do anything. He never writes that the Balrog answered to Sauron or received instructions from him. The Balrog had served Morgoth in the First Age, and Morgoth was gone, cast into the void at the end of the War of Wrath. Sauron was Morgoth's lieutenant, but that did not automatically give him authority over Morgoth's other servants, particularly one as powerful and as old as a Balrog. This distinction matters. The Orcs of Moria may have served Sauron in a general sense, as many Orcs did, but the Balrog operated independently. There is no evidence of a chain of command connecting the two. The Balrog did not emerge to fight Sauron's wars. It did not march to the Battle of Five Armies. It did not participate in the War of the Ring until the Fellowship entered Moria. It did not attack Lothlorien, which lay just east of the Misty Mountains, and would have been a natural target if the Balrog were acting under Sauron's direction. It stayed in Moria. This behavior is consistent with a solitary survivor of a fallen regime, not with a lieutenant following orders from a new master. One theory attempts to connect the Balrog's presence in Moria to Sauron's broader strategy through the Seven Dwarf-rings. Sauron captured or recovered several of the rings he had given to the Dwarf Lords. The ring of the Longbeards, the House of Durin, was the last to be taken. Thrain II, father of Thorin Oakenshield, was captured in TA 2845 and held in Dol Guldur, where Sauron took the last of the seven from him. The theory suggests that Sauron may have used the dwarf ring of Durin's house to influence events in Khazad-dûm, perhaps stirring the Balrog or directing the Orcs there through the ring's residual connection to the Longbeards and their ancient hall. This is a plausible hypothesis, and it would explain how Sauron could have some indirect influence over Moria without directly commanding the Balrog. But Tolkien never confirms it. He never writes that the ring was used to control the Balrog or that it had any power over the demon. The theory remains speculative, an interesting possibility built from known facts about the rings and Sauron's recovery of them, but not a confirmed part of the history. Without a confirmed command relationship, the coexistence of Orcs and Balrog in Moria must be explained through other means. The most likely model is one of territorial separation, maintained by fear and distance. Khazad-dûm was vast. It was the largest underground complex in Middle-earth, a network of halls, passages, mines, and chambers stretching for miles beneath the Misty Mountains. The deepest levels, where the mithril seams had been and where the Balrog had been released, were far below the upper halls. The Balrog appears to have remained in those deep regions for most of the Third Age. It did not roam the upper halls. It did not patrol the gates. It stayed below, in the dark, in the roots of the mountains where the dwarfs had first found it. The Orcs, for their part, occupied the upper levels. They used the passages and halls near the entrances, the old dwarf roads that connected the East Gate to the West Gate. They had been using these routes for centuries, moving through the mountains via Moria as a convenient passage between their strongholds. The Orcs of the Misty Mountains were practical. They took what territory they could hold and avoided what they could not. The Balrog was a being of immense power, a Maia in its own right, older than the Orcs and far more dangerous. The Orcs would have known of its presence. They had occupied Moria for centuries before the Fellowship's passage, and the Balrog had been there for over 5,000 years. The Orcs would have feared it. Fear is a sufficient explanation for avoidance. The Orcs stayed in the upper halls because the deep levels were the Balrog's domain, and entering the Balrog's domain meant death. This was not a treaty. There is no record of any agreement between the Orcs and the Balrog. The Balrog did not negotiate with the Orcs. It did not grant them permission to use the upper halls. The arrangement was one of mutual avoidance, enforced by the simple reality of power. The Balrog did not care about the orcs in the upper halls, or if it did not act against them. The orcs did not challenge the Balrog in the deep levels. Each occupied a different zone of the same ruined kingdom, and the vastness of Khazad-dûm made this possible. The mountain was large enough to hold both without forcing contact. The evidence for this model comes from several sources. The most important is the Battle of Azanul-Bizar in TA 2799. After the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, in which the Dwarves sought vengeance for Azog's killing of Thror in Moria, the climactic battle was fought in the valley of Azanul-Bizar, outside the east gate of Khazad-dûm. The Dwarves, led by Nain of the Iron Hills, defeated the Orcs of Moria. Azog was killed by Dain Ironfoot, who was then a young warrior. The Dwarves had the strength to enter Moria and reclaim it. The Orcs were broken. The gate was open, but Dain refused to lead the Dwarves back inside. He looked through the gate into the dark of Khazad-dûm and saw something, or felt something, that stopped him. He warned the other dwarf lords that something still dwelt in the depths, something that the dwarves were not yet ready to face. He would not name it, but the implication was clear. The Balrog was still there, and its presence alone was enough to deter the dwarves from reoccupying their ancestral home. This moment is critical evidence. The dwarves had just won a great victory. They had the numbers and the will to reclaim Khazad-dûm. The orcs were defeated. Yet the Balrog's presence, unspoken and unseen, was sufficient to keep them out. If the Balrog could deter the entire dwarven host from entering Moria after a decisive military victory, it could certainly keep the surviving orcs confined to the upper halls. The orcs who remained in Moria after Azanul-Bizar were the remnant of a defeated force. They had no capacity to challenge the Balrog. They survived by staying in the parts of the mountain where the Balrog did not go. Dain's warning also confirms that the Balrog was not dormant in the sense of being completely inactive. It was present. Its presence was perceptible, at least to someone as perceptive as Dain. The Balrog may have been quiet. It may have stayed in the deep places, but it was awake, and its existence was a known factor. The dwarves did not enter because they knew or sensed that the deep levels were occupied by something they could not defeat. This is the same dynamic that would have governed the orcs' behavior. They knew the Balrog was there. They stayed away from it. It stayed away from them. The mountain was big enough for both. The Balrog remained in Moria for the entire Third Age, over 3,000 years after the dwarves fled. This is a long time for any being to stay in one place, and the reasons are worth examining. The Balrog was a survivor of the First Age, a remnant of Morgoth's host. It had no master. Morgoth was gone. Sauron was active, but had no confirmed authority over it. The Balrog had no army, no allies, no political purpose. It was a solitary creature of fire and shadow living in the ruins of a dwarf kingdom. Its motivation, to the extent that a Maya corrupted by Morgoth could be said to have motivation, was likely to remain hidden and to survive. The deep places of the world offered concealment. Khazad-dûm was vast, dark, and defensible. The Balrog had no reason to leave and no reason to reveal itself. The world above had changed. The Eldar had diminished. The Númenóreans had fallen. The kingdoms of men were weak. But the Balrog did not seek conquest. It sought obscurity, and Moria provided it. The Fellowship of the Ring changed this. In January of TA 3019, the 9 walkers entered Moria through the west gate, the doors of Durin. They were fleeing the Crebain and the wolves of Sauron, and needed a passage through the misty mountains. Gandalf, who was a Loren in the west, had been through Moria before, but the passage was dangerous and uncertain. The Fellowship moved through the upper halls, following the old dwarf road eastward. They were discovered by the Orcs of Moria, who attacked them in the Chamber of Mazarbul, the Chamber of Records. The Orcs included a cave troll, and the fight was fierce. The Fellowship escaped, but the noise and the disturbance in the deep places attracted the Balrog's attention. Gandalf led the company eastward, through passages that descended and climbed, moving through the heart of the mountain. At the bridge of Khazad-dûm, the narrow span over a chasm in the deep levels, the Balrog appeared. It came from behind them, from the depths they had been approaching. The description is vivid. It was a dark shape, a man shape, but greater, wreathed in shadow and flame. It carried a whip in one hand and a blade in the other. Fire burned in its core, and darkness surrounded it. Gandalf confronted it on the bridge. He struck the bridge with his staff, and the narrow span broke, casting the Balrog into the chasm. The Balrog's whip caught Gandalf's leg and pulled him down as well. Both fell into the deep places beneath Moria. They fought in the depths for 10 days. The pursuit led them down through the roots of the mountain, through passages and caverns far below the halls the dwarves had ever known. They climbed the endless stair, a spiral staircase that rose from the lowest depths to the peak of Zirak-Sigil, the mountain above Moria. On the peak, Gandalf fought the Balrog in open combat. He slew it there, casting it down from the mountain. The Balrog broke the mountainside as it fell. Gandalf himself died from his wounds and was later sent back, returned as Gandalf the White to complete his task in Middle-earth. The Fellowship's passage through Moria was the trigger. For over 3,000 years, the Balrog had remained in the deep levels, undisturbed except by the dwarves' mining and the brief intrusion of the dwarven host after Azanul-Bizar. The Fellowship's entry, the battle with the Orcs, the noise and movement in the halls, and Gandalf's presence as a Maya of equal stature drew the Balrog out. Gandalf was a Lorin, a Maya of the same order as the Balrog. The Balrog may have sensed him, may have recognized him as a threat or a rival, and may have been drawn to confront him specifically. The battle at the bridge was not a random encounter. It was a confrontation between two Maya, one corrupted by Morgoth and one sent by the Valar to oppose Sauron. The Balrog had avoided the world for millennia. Gandalf's presence in Moria forced the encounter. The question of the Balrog's appearance and nature deserves attention, though many details are uncertain. Tolkien describes the Balrog as a dark figure of man-shape, greater than a man, with a mane of fire and a surrounding darkness. It carried a whip of many thongs and a sword. In the First Age, Balrogs are described carrying weapons including axes and maces. Gothmog used a black axe and a mace. Durin's Bane used a blade and a whip. The fire and shadow are consistent features. The Balrog's body was cloaked in darkness, and fire burned within it, so that it appeared as a figure of flame wrapped in shadow. The question of wings is disputed. Tolkien writes that the Balrog's shadow reached out like two vast wings. This phrase has been read both literally and metaphorically. Some readers take it to mean the Balrog had actual wings of shadow. Others read it as a simile, describing the spread of the Balrog's darkness. The text does not settle the matter definitively. The Balrog fell from the bridge into the chasm, and if it had functional wings, it did not use them to arrest its fall. This has been cited as evidence against literal wings, but the chasm may have been too narrow for flight, or the Balrog may have been too wounded or too surprised to fly. The question remains open. Tolkien's language is ambiguous, and the published texts do not provide a definitive answer. The question of speech is also uncertain. Tolkien never records a Balrog speaking in any of the published narratives. The Balrogs of the First Age are described in action, not in dialogue. Durin's Bane does not speak during its confrontation with Gandalf. This silence has led some readers to suggest that Balrogs could not speak, but Tolkien never states this. The Balrogs were Maiar, spirits of the same order as Sauron and Gandalf, both of whom spoke extensively. The Maiar were rational beings capable of speech. The absence of recorded speech does not prove the absence of the capacity for speech. The Balrogs may have spoken, or they may have communicated in other ways. The possibility of telepathic or non-verbal communication among Maiar is a subject of speculation, and Tolkien's writings on the mental powers of the Maiar are limited. The question is open. The question of sunlight is another area of uncertainty. Some readers have suggested that Balrogs could not endure sunlight, which would explain why Durin's Bane stayed underground. But Tolkien never states that Balrogs were harmed by the sun. In the First Age, Balrogs fought in battles that took place in daylight. Gothmog fought Fingon at the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, which was fought in the open. The Balrogs attacked Gondolin in an assault that occurred during the day. There is no record of sunlight weakening or harming them. Durin's Bane's confinement to Moria was not driven by an inability to endure the sun. It was driven by the Balrog's choice to remain hidden, to survive in the deep places after the fall of Morgoth. The Balrog fought Gandalf on the peak of Zirak-Sigil in the open air, and it was not destroyed by exposure to the sky. It was destroyed by Gandalf's power in combat. The sunlight question is settled by the First Age evidence. Balrogs could operate in daylight, and Durin's Bane's underground existence was a matter of strategy, not weakness. The number of Balrogs is another disputed point. Tolkien's early writings, particularly the narratives from the 1910s and 1920s, describe Balrogs in large numbers. The Fall of Gondolin, one of the earliest narratives, speaks of hundreds of Balrogs. In later writings, Tolkien reduced the number significantly. The published Silmarillion, compiled by Christopher Tolkien from later and more mature texts, describes Balrogs in smaller numbers. The statement that the Balrogs were Morgoth's most feared servants suggests a limited group, not a vast army. The exact number is uncertain. Tolkien's conception changed over time, and the early numbers are generally considered less authoritative than the later ones. What is clear is that by the end of the First Age, after the War of Wrath, most Balrogs had been destroyed. Durin's Bane was one of the last, perhaps the last, and its survival was a matter of escape, not of victory. The early names and conceptions of Balrogs also changed. In some of Tolkien's earliest writings, Balrogs had different names and characteristics. One early name, Cosamot, appears in the earliest narratives as a Balrog or Balrog-like figure, but this name was abandoned and does not appear in the later published texts. These early names and conceptions are part of the history of Tolkien's creative process, but they are not part of the established canon of the published works. They are early, speculative, and superseded by later writings. The Balrog as it appears in The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion is the authoritative version, and the earlier drafts are of interest to scholars but not to the established history of Middle-earth. The film adaptation, directed by Peter Jackson, presented a specific visual design for the Balrog. It was a large, horned figure of shadow and flame, with a mane of fire and a body of darkness. The film's Balrog had wings, or at least wing-like extensions of shadow. The film's depiction is striking and memorable, but it is a design choice, not a textual fact. The book describes the Balrog in less specific visual terms. The book's Balrog is a figure of shadow and flame, man-shaped but greater, with a whip and a blade. The wings are ambiguous. The horns are not mentioned. The film's design is a creative interpretation, and it should be kept separate from the book evidence. The book's Balrog is defined by its nature as a Maya, its fire and shadow, its weapons and its power, not by a specific visual design. The question of why the Orcs did not touch the Balrog in Moria has a direct answer. The Balrog was a Maya of immense power, a survivor of the First Age, and a former servant of Morgoth. The Orcs were mortal creatures of far lesser strength. The Balrog occupied the deepest levels of Khazad-dûm, and the Orcs occupied the upper halls. The mountain was vast enough to allow this separation. The Orcs feared the Balrog as the dwarves had feared it, and with good reason. The Balrog had killed 2 dwarf kings and driven an entire civilization from its home. Its presence alone, sensed but unseen, was enough to keep Dane Ironfoot and the dwarven host from re-entering Moria after the Battle of Azanulbizar. If it could deter the dwarves at the height of their military power, it could certainly keep the Orcs confined to the upper levels. There was no treaty between the Orcs and the Balrog. There was no alliance. The Balrog did not command the Orcs, and the Orcs did not serve the Balrog. Sauron had no recorded direct command over the Balrog. The Dwarf-ring theory offers a possible mechanism for indirect Sauronic influence in Moria, but it remains unconfirmed speculation. The coexistence was one of avoidance, maintained by the geography of Khazad-dûm, the power disparity between the two parties, and the Balrog's preference for the deep places. The Balrog stayed below because it chose to stay below. The Orcs stayed above because they could not survive below. The mountain held both, and the mountain kept them apart. The Fellowship's passage in TA 3019 broke this equilibrium. Gandalf's presence as a Maya drew the Balrog to the upper levels for the first time in centuries. The battle on the bridge of Khazad-dûm and the subsequent fight on the peak of Zirak-Zigil ended the Balrog's long occupation of Moria. The creature that had hidden in the roots of the misty mountains since the end of the First Age was destroyed. The question of why the Orcs never touched it is answered by the same facts that explain why the dwarves never returned after Nain-Ai's death. The Balrog was too powerful to challenge, and the deep levels of Khazad-dûm were its domain. The Orcs knew this. The dwarves knew this. Dain Ironfoot knew this when he looked through the east gate and refused to enter. The Balrog's presence was sufficient. It did not need to fight the Orcs because the Orcs would not fight it. It did not need to drive them out because they would not enter its territory. The coexistence in Moria was not friendship, not alliance, not command. It was separation, enforced by fear and by the sheer scale of the ruined kingdom they shared.